Imagine having your soul full of melodies, but your lungs full of blood. Imagine composing works that move kings without raising your voice, without an orchestra, without loudness. This is not a story of massive concerts or spectacular tours. It is the story of a melancholic, sickly young man who spoke little but said everything with the piano. Today you will meet Frédéric Chopin, the silent genius who turned pain into art and the piano into poetry. On March 1, 1810, in a modest house in the village of Zelazowa Wala, west of Warsaw, a child was born who would forever change the history of piano music. His name, Frédéric François Chopin, or Frédéric Franciszek, as they called him in his homeland. A son of two worlds, Polish mother, French father. And perhaps because of that, he would always live between two souls. His father, Nicholas Chopin, was born in Lorraine, but moved to Poland during his youth. There he fell in love with Justyna Krzyżanowska, a young woman of noble origin who had fallen on hard times. Although financially limited, both were cultured, educated, and deeply sensitive. Music was not a luxury, but a necessity. In their home, the piano and singing were part of daily life. Frédéric grew up surrounded by strong, music-loving women. He had 3 sisters, and from a very young age he showed an uncommon sensitivity. At 4 years old, he was already seen imitating melodies he heard. By 5, he improvised at the keyboard with an expressiveness that left adults astonished. His first teacher was his own mother, but soon his parents realized that this was not mere childish talent. It was something exceptional. That is why they decided to entrust his training to Wojciech Zywny, a Czech musician settled in Warsaw. Zywny, accustomed to teaching noble children, discovered that this little boy not only learned at an unusual speed, but was already composing his own pieces with clear structures and genuine feeling. At 7, he composed his first Polonaise, and at just 8, he gave his first public concert in the aristocratic Radziwiłł Salon in Warsaw. The newspaper reviews of the time spoke of a little Polish Mozart. And although Chopin did not like comparisons, his fame quickly grew among the local nobility. But the most curious thing was his character. Far from the image of child prodigies who enjoy applause, Chopin was reserved, shy, introspective. He hated ostentation. Even as an adult, he would avoid large stages. He preferred intimate salons, where the whisper of the piano could be heard with the audience's held breath. While Chopin grew, so did Warsaw, a city marked by hope and trauma. After centuries of partitions and foreign occupation, the dream of a free Poland was still alive, though constantly threatened by neighboring empires. Chopin would grow up with that open wound, the sense of a lost homeland, a constant nostalgia that would later permeate almost all his music. They lived in the Saxon Palace, where his father worked as a teacher, and although it was an imposing building, their apartment was modest. But what was never lacking were books, sheet music, deep conversations, and a piano. There, Chopin developed not only his technique, which was already astonishing since childhood, but also a unique melodic sensitivity. He did not imitate other composers. His music, even from childhood, had its own voice. Melancholic, poetic, unmistakable. Besides the piano, Chopin was interested in literature, drawing, theater, and the French language, which he spoke fluently. He was a cultured boy, with refined manners and an introspective gaze. At 11 years old, he was already playing for the Polish aristocracy, and many said that if the country had a voice, it would be that of his piano. At 12, Chopin was no longer just the child prodigy of Warsaw. He was a young artist in formation, with a technique that challenged professionals and a musicality that moved even the most skeptical. In 1823, he entered the Warsaw Lyceum, and later, in 1826, he began formal studies at the conservatory under the direction of Joseph Elsner. Elsner, a respected composer, was one of the few who understood the dimension of Chopin's talent. In his academic notes, he wrote, "Exceptional musical talent, genius." But beyond recognition, he knew how to give him freedom. He did not try to turn him into an academic composer nor mold him in the image of the great classics. He let his voice flourish. During this stage, Chopin began to polish what would become his definitive hallmark. Music written for piano, as if the piano were singing. His technique did not seek empty showmanship. There was no need for fireworks. His expressiveness said everything. Works like the Rondo Op. 1, the First Nocturnes, and the sketches of mazurkas and polonaises already show that unique fusion between the classical and the popular, between cultivated art and the Polish soul. If you like music, at the end of this video I am going to reveal you the best books for musicians, such as practical guides for learning to play the piano, inspiring biographies of great composers, and books on success secrets that reveal the discipline and creativity needed to thrive in music. Find them in the description. But Chopin's music cannot be understood without understanding his land. In those years, Poland lived a false calm. The Congress of Vienna had left the country as a kingdom of the Tsar, technically autonomous, but controlled from St. Petersburg. Polish identity, repressed for generations, was expressed in culture, in literature, and in music. Chopin absorbed that tension. In his mazurkas, based on Polish peasant dances, there is not only rhythm and folklore. There is melancholy, nostalgia, resistance. Each measure seems to say, "This is who we are. This is what we have lost." During his youth, he befriended artists and intellectuals who dreamed of a free Poland. Although he was not a political activist, his music became an act of national memory. Not with shouts, but with whispers. Not with speeches, but with harmonies. In 1829, at barely 19 years old, Chopin traveled to Vienna, the musical capital of Europe, to present himself to society. There he gave 2 concerts that astonished the critics. His style was completely new. Neither German, nor Italian, nor French. It was Chopinesque. The Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung described him as a young man of extraordinary poetic expression. And the Viennese public, accustomed to the mechanical brilliance of some virtuosos, was struck by his expressive delicacy. However, it was not all applause. Chopin felt uncomfortable with the superficiality of the Viennese environment. He preferred Warsaw's cafes, where he could talk about poetry and politics, rather than the noise of aristocratic halls. He returned to Poland that same year, more mature, more aware, and more restless. In November 1830, shortly before embarking on a tour that would take him again to Vienna and then to Paris, the November uprising broke out in Warsaw, an insurrection against Russian rule. Chopin was already in Vienna when the news arrived. For weeks, he lived in an unbearable state of anxiety. He obsessively read newspapers, wrote desperate letters asking about his parents, his friends, his city. He wanted to return, but his loved ones begged him not to. It was no longer safe. And then something happened that would mark his whole life. He would never return to Poland. From that moment on, all his music would be impregnated with absence. It doesn't matter if he was composing a mazurka or a technical etude, a nocturne or a heroic polonaise. There is always an invisible tear between the notes. Chopin became a perpetual exile, a Pole without land, with his heart buried in Warsaw and his body wandering through Europe. It was 1831 when Frédéric Chopin arrived in Paris, a city that for many was the center of the world, but for him meant something else, the certainty that he would never return home. He was only 21 years old, carrying a suitcase with scores, a letter of recommendation, and a heart broken by distance. At first, Paris received him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. In a city where pianists abounded, what could a pale, discreet young man who barely spoke in public offer? The answer came soon. A single private recital was enough for rumors to start spreading. There is a new pianist in Paris. He doesn't play, he sighs. Little by little, Chopin began to make his way. And not in large theaters. His natural space was the aristocratic salons, the intimate spaces where his style made sense. There he met some of the most brilliant artists of his time. The painter Delacroix, the poet Heine, the composer Berlioz, and above all, Franz Liszt. Liszt and Chopin could not have been more different. One, extroverted, fiery, charismatic. The other, reserved, ethereal, almost spectral. But they admired each other. Liszt even said that when Chopin plays, you don't hear a piano, you hear a soul. In Paris, Chopin finally found the space to develop his art without concessions. He published his first nocturnes, his etudes, and the Polonaises Op. 26, which established him as a first-rate composer. But the most remarkable thing about his music was not the technique, although it was overwhelming, nor the harmonies, although they were innovative. What made his work unique was that, for the first time, the piano sounded intimate, human, confessional. While many composers were still writing for the masses, Chopin was writing for the soul. His pieces were not grand heroic statements, but musical letters, diary fragments, whispers of emotion. Publishers fought to release his works. Aristocrats wanted him as a teacher for their daughters. But Chopin remained selective. He was not interested in noisy fame or endless tours. His world was inward, and Paris, with all its noise, offered him at least a corner from which to keep composing in peace. Not everything was success. In 1835, during a brief trip through Germany, he reunited with Maria Wadzinska, a young Polish aristocrat with whom he had shared friendship in his adolescence. They fell in love, exchanged tender letters, and Chopin even went so far as to ask for her hand in marriage. But her family did not approve of the idea of their daughter marrying a sick, poor, and exiled artist. The relationship ended, and with it, a new layer of pain was added to Chopin's music. Years later, a letter signed with the phrase, "My heart is broken," would be the only memory of that story. The failed romance, however, drove him to compose some of his most profound works. It was around this time that the Preludes Op. 28 were born, 24 short pieces that seemed to condense all human emotions, from calm to despair, from tenderness to terror. But while his music blossomed, his body began to decline. From a young age, Chopin had suffered from fragile health, persistent cough, fevers, weight loss. Although it was never formally diagnosed during his life, everything indicates that he suffered from tuberculosis, a common but deadly disease at the time. Every concert was an effort, every trip a risk, and yet he continued composing with unusual clarity and depth. As if sensing his time would be short, Chopin wrote as one running against death. In the winter of 1836, during one of the many Parisian soirees where music, literature, and politics intertwined, Chopin was introduced to a woman of elegant bearing, intense gaze, and a lit cigarette, George Sand. Her real name was Aurora Dupin, but she wrote under a male pseudonym to be taken seriously in a literary world dominated by men. Divorced, mother of two, intellectual, feminist, and radical, Sand broke every mold of her time. For many, she was scandalous. For Chopin, she was incomprehensible. His first impression was negative. "Is that a woman?" he asked, almost disdainfully. But, as with everything in life that matters, the attraction was slow, silent, and definitive. The following year, they began a relationship that would last almost a decade. It was not an impulsive passion nor a bohemian adventure. It was a complex union, intellectual and deeply emotional. Sand became Chopin's protector, nurse, and confidant, and he, her refuge in sound. During the summers, the couple would retreat to the estate George Sand owned in Nohant, in the center of France. That place, surrounded by gardens, trees, and silence, became the setting for Chopin's most fertile period as a composer. There, away from the bustle of Paris and social demands, some of his most mature and moving works were born. The ballades, the scherzos, the last nocturnes, the waltzes, the deepest mazurkas, and the most epic polonaises. In Nohant, Chopin wrote every morning. He spent hours correcting, rewriting, refining. He was obsessive about every note. It is said that once he spent 6 weeks working on a single page, unable to accept a phrase that did not say exactly what he felt. George Sand, although sometimes impatient, respected his process. She said that Chopin suffered more than he composed, and that his work was a kind of emotional exorcism. In 1838, hoping to find a more favorable climate for Chopin's health, the couple traveled to the island of Majorca, in Spain. At first, the environment seemed ideal: palm trees, sun, sea. But the situation quickly changed. The winter was unusually damp, and Chopin fell gravely ill. They lived in an old monastery in Valdemasa, without heating, without a doctor, and rejected by the locals who feared contagion. There, in the midst of fever and despair, Chopin composed one of his most visionary cycles, the 24 Preludes Op. 28. Each one, an emotional miniature, contained storm, a broken breath. There is no formal logic between them, only a succession of moods, as if Chopin were writing a sonic chronicle of his sick soul. Eventually, the couple left the island and returned to France, with Chopin in critical condition. Sand cared for him day and night. Years later, she would write, "I fed him like a sick bird, with drops of milk between his lips." Despite the physical ups and downs, Chopin continued composing, giving private lessons and receiving commissions. He was admired by artists, revered by students, and coveted by the Parisian aristocracy, although he always remained aloof from spectacle. He was often invited to play in large halls, but he refused. "I don't have the strength to play among people who cough," he said ironically. He preferred intimate salons, where the piano could sound like a shared whisper. However, his relationship with George Sand began to deteriorate. Differences of character, tension with her children, jealousy, and emotional strain eventually exhausted what had once been love. In 1847, they broke up for good. Chopin said nothing publicly. He wrote no letters of reproach nor sought reconciliation. He simply withdrew into his silence and into his music. After the definitive break with George Sand in 1847, something also broke inside Chopin. For almost a decade, she had been his emotional and physical support. Now, with his health in decline and his soul wounded, isolation became total. He was barely 37 years old, but he looked much older. His figure, already fragile, became increasingly spectral. Thin, pale, with a persistent cough that filled his handkerchiefs with blood. Many said he looked like a living shadow. But amid this physical decay, his music continued to shine with an intense light, although an increasingly somber one. Chopin continued composing, but less frequently. The works of these last years have a more introspective, sometimes desolate tone. The Mazurka Op. 63 No. 3, for example, written after the separation from Sand, seems like a melancholic farewell to everything he once loved. His homeland, his love, his youth. The Polonaise Fantaisie Op. 61, written shortly after, is perhaps his most ambiguous work. Heroic and painful at the same time, free in form, disconcerting in character. It is as if Chopin were no longer writing for others, but only for himself. In 1848, amid a Europe shaken by revolutions and with his income dwindling, Chopin agreed to go on tour in England and Scotland, invited by British admirers who still revered him as an icon of Romanticism. Despite being very ill, he accepted out of financial need. He had few options. Students were scarce, publishers were reluctant, and the Parisian aristocracy, also impoverished by the conflicts, had stopped financing their favorite artists. For several months, Chopin traveled from city to city, giving recitals in noble houses, private gatherings, and some public concerts. He played before Queen Victoria, was honored by Lord Byron, received flowers, tributes, applause, but his body could take no more. The constant travel, the dampness, the effort of playing and teaching, slowly wore him down. In Scotland, his condition became critical. He could barely climb a staircase without collapsing. He needed help even to dress. In his letters, he wrote with dark humor, "I am no longer a musician, I am a mummy." When he finally returned to Paris at the end of 1848, he was no longer the same. Despite his fame, he lived with just enough. His apartment was modest, visitors scarce. He spent entire days in bed, unable to write, speak, or even eat without difficulty. His circle was reduced to a few loyal friends. His student Jane Stirling, the painter Delacroix, some doctors, and his sister Ludwika, who traveled from Poland to be with him. Chopin, who had spent his life surrounded by aristocrats, artists, and salons, ended his existence surrounded by silence and intimate care. But even then, he kept teaching. Sometimes he asked to have his students brought to his room. He would speak to them in a low voice, point out the most delicate passages with a single finger, and then cough for minutes on end. He never complained. He never protested. He simply kept being music, even as his body crumbled. The year was 1849. Chopin could barely get out of bed. His body, consumed by tuberculosis, was slowly turning into living ashes. He ate little, slept poorly, but he still spoke of music. In his final months, the only things he asked for were silence and presence. He hated the medical commotion. He preferred to hear the sound of leaves in the wind rather than his doctor's diagnoses. He knew he was going to die. He didn't say it with sadness, but with acceptance. His concern was not death, but memory. He begged those around him not to let his art be forgotten, to safeguard his manuscripts, not to falsify his voice. His sister Ludwika, who had come from Warsaw, never left his side. His closest friends, like Delacroix and Jane Stirling, organized visits in turns. Chopin could no longer teach or compose, but he kept whispering instructions on how he wanted certain passages of his works to sound. In the last days of October, the illness worsened. Chopin could no longer sit up without help. He had a high fever, and every breath was a painful sigh. Even so, he asked for musicians to come, but not to play his works. He wanted to hear Mozart's Requiem, and so it was. On October 16, 1849, in his room, fragments of that work, which had moved him so deeply since youth, were performed. As the chords of the Lacrimosa sounded, Chopin closed his eyes, as if he were already seeing the other side. In the early hours of October 17th, his breathing stopped. He was 39 years old. The man who had turned the piano into a universal language died without a homeland, without fortune, and without scandals. He died discreetly, with the same elegance with which he had lived. His death deeply shook Paris. The funeral was held on October 30th at the Church of La Madeleine, and thousands of people attended. Aristocrats, artists, politicians, students, the curious, everyone wanted to say goodbye to the man who had never needed to raise his voice to touch the hearts of Europe. During the ceremony, Mozart's Requiem was played, as he had requested. Instead of piano music, the prelude in E minor, Op. 28 No. 4, was heard, performed by a string orchestra. One of the most melancholic pieces ever written, now turned into an epitaph. He was buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery, alongside other great names of European culture. But his heart, literally, was sent to Poland, preserved in a jar of cognac and placed in a column of the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw. A perfect symbol. His body in France, but his heart where it had always been. With his death, the legend began. Posthumous editions, biographies, tributes were published. His figure grew beyond his music. Chopin became the symbol of the lost homeland, of the pure artist, of the silent genius. But beyond the myth, his work remained. 24 preludes, 21 nocturnes, 58 mazurkas, 27 etudes, for ballades, 2 concertos, and many more. Works that, even today, remind us that true emotion does not need to shout. Just a piano and truth. More than 170 years after his death, the music of Frédéric Chopin is still alive. Not because it is played in international competitions or in conservatories, but because it continues to move us. Every time someone sits at the piano and plays one of his nocturnes in silence, Chopin lives again. Every time a mazurka is danced in Poland, or a waltz is heard in a film, his voice resounds. Chopin didn't need to write symphonies or monumental operas. His entire universe fit within a keyboard of ivory and ebony. But within that narrow space, he managed to create an emotional ocean. He was admired by Liszt, feared by Schumann, respected by Mendelssohn, and revered by entire generations of musicians. Claude Debussy said that without him, there would be no Impressionism. Rubinstein called him the son of the piano, and for the Polish people, he is still a national symbol today. But perhaps the most astonishing thing is that his music, so intimate, transcends cultures, languages, and centuries. You may know nothing of Poland or Romanticism or classical music, but if you listen to a Chopin nocturne with your eyes closed, something inside you will move. Frédéric Chopin did not shout. He did not march to war. He did not write manifestos, nor proclaim revolutions. He simply composed. And, in the silence of his rooms, he wrote some of the most human pages in the history of music. If the story moved you, if you have ever felt something inexplicable while listening to a piano, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to keep discovering the lives of the great composers who, like Chopin, transformed pain into beauty and sound into emotion. Here we will tell you more stories like this. Intimate, complex, inspiring. Thank you for joining us, and remember, music does not need to be explained. It only needs to be felt.